Hello and welcome to Need to Know Space. I'm Space Kate and I'm here to guide you through the biggest space stories that have been in the news for the past few weeks, all those things that have caught my eye and I think that you should perhaps know about too. If you haven't already, please do click on that subscribe button and let's get started. There's plenty to get through. Now, of course, the headline is Starliner, the crewed test flight of the Boeing Starliner that took Butch and Suni, the astronauts, up to the International Space Station, and we have been waiting on a decision from NASA as to whether they would allow the astronauts to return in Starliner or use an alternative vehicle, the SpaceX Crew Dragon. Now, I'm recording this just before the press conference that's going to announce that final decision, so I'm going to do two versions of this, and whichever one you end up seeing, that means that's the decision that has been made. So, it looks like NASA have finally decided that they are going to bring Butch and Suni home on the Dragon spacecraft, that's the SpaceX capsule, rather than completing the crew test flight of the Starliner vehicle. So we know that the vehicle had some issues on the way up to space. Butch and Suni have been on the International Space Station for a couple of months now, and they're just testing everything that they can to try and work out what were the root causes of the issues with the thrusters, and would that cause any issues for them on the way back home. Now, Boeing have always said that they were confident in their vehicle, the Starliner, to bring Butch and Suni home safely, but it seems that NASA have decided to err on the side of caution, and given the fact that they are in this incredible position to have two American crew vehicles that can get astronauts to and from space, they've decided to go with the vehicle that has been tested and used operationally for a bit longer, and that's the SpaceX Dragon capsule. Now, what this means is that the astronauts that were supposed to go on the Crew 9 mission, they're launching no earlier than the 24th of September, there should have been a crew of 4 on that flight. In fact, it will only be 2 people who fly up to the space station, and they'll take SpaceX suits for Butch and Suni. And when their expedition on the space station is over, so that's a 6-month expedition, they will come home and Butch and Suni will take those 2 extra seats in the Dragon capsule to come home. That's kind of a big deal. Yeah, I mean, I guess this is a first. It's the first time that America has had a second option in terms of a crew capsule to bring people home in. When they were testing the Dragon capsule, doing the crewed flight test of Dragon, they didn't have another vehicle they could send up. They didn't have something else that they knew how it worked and that they were sure would bring back the astronauts safely. So I'm sure a lot of discussion has gone into this. There's been all sorts of research done. They've been looking at the data in space from tests on the ground to try and work out exactly what it was that was causing an issue with those thrusters. But in the end, NASA have decided to go ahead and bring Butch and Suni home in February 2025 on the Crew 9 capsule, with the Dragon capsule. So that means they will be now part of the next ISS increment, and they'll be fully formed members of the ISS crew. Currently they're additional to the full crew, and that has been putting a bit of strain on the resources available. Obviously they do get deliveries. There was a cargo container that went up just last week. It's been quite a busy time on station, but it does mean that the Starliner capsule will now return to Earth uncrewed, and they will continue their tests and data analysis on that. I'm unsure if they will require further testing, what will happen with that program. I'll probably do another video on this when we get more details, but what we know now is that Butch and Suni are coming home on the SpaceX Dragon capsule rather than returning and completing the crew test flight of the Boeing Starliner. While we're talking about human spaceflight and SpaceX, there's another few big stories in the offing. So just in a few days' time, it was due on the 26th of August, but it's now been pushed to the 27th of August, is the Polaris Dawn mission that's launching up into space. Now, this is a commercial flight, it's a privately paid for flight of a SpaceX capsule. It's funded by Jarek Isaacman, who did the Inspiration 4 mission. And this time they're really pushing the boundaries of what can be done in private spaceflight, because they want to conduct the first private spacewalk. So that's quite an exciting thing, and this is definitely a mission that you want to be watching out for. So the idea is that they're going to go up into space. They will then test these new EVA, that's extravehicular activity suits, or spacewalk suits, and 2 of the crew will leave the capsule. They'll be attached via an umbilical, some tubes and wires that keep them attached to the spacecraft and give them the oxygen that they need. But they will actually leave the spacecraft, and the other 2 crew members will be inside the spacecraft, monitoring things, testing things, and checking how the suits work. Now, this is very exciting because there's never been a private spacewalk done before, and it's also quite interesting because usually, or I say usually, in modern times, with the space shuttle, with the International Space Station, we have an airlock that the spacewalkers will go into, which is then depressurized, and off they go into the vacuum of space and do their spacewalk. What that means is that the rest of the crew of the vehicle or the space station can just carry on their everyday lives, carry on with their work. They don't need to don a big heavy spacesuit to remain able to breathe. In this test, the Dragon capsule doesn't have an airlock, so the entire capsule is going to be depressurized, and that's why all 4 members of the crew need to be wearing these new SpaceX suits. So it's a really interesting mission. 2 of the crew are actually SpaceX engineers. One of them who had trained the astronauts for the Inspiration 4 mission. So they'll be excited. They'll be the first SpaceX employees to fly into space on a SpaceX capsule as well. So there's lots of exciting stuff happening there. So keep an eye out. If you're in the US, I'm afraid to say the launch window is at 3:38 a.m. For Eastern Daily Time. That's slightly better for me. It's 7:38 in the morning here in British Standard Time, British Summer Time even. It's a 4-hour window, so yes, if you do end up getting up at 3:38 for the launch, let's hope they go on time and don't keep you waiting for that full 4 hours before you get the launch. But I will see you there online, #LaunchClub. I'll be watching. Now, you think that might be enough for human spaceflight, SpaceX, and commercial missions, but no, actually, we recently heard of a new mission that has been proposed called Fram II. Now, this is another privately funded mission using a SpaceX capsule. It's Chinese crypto entrepreneur Chen Wang who's provided the funding for that. And the Fram II name is after a Norwegian exploration ship, Fram I, that was around in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and explored both the Arctic and the Antarctic. Fram II is intending to do exactly that, explore both the Arctic and the Antarctic, but doing so from space. Now, this is another interesting development for commercial space. No human spacecraft has ever been in a polar orbit before. So the way that you calculate the orbits, if you imagine the equator is a 0, and that would be you going round the widest part of the Earth, just round and round. If you incline your orbit slightly, so 10 degrees, you would be flying over slightly different things. 45 degrees, you'd see different bits of the world. Now, the highest inclination orbit that's ever been done with humans before was Vostok by the Soviets back in the 1960s, and they managed a sort of 65-degree orbit. Now, for Fram II, they're going to need to be in an 80 to 90-degree orbit in order that they're flying right over both the Antarctic and the Arctic as they fly around the Earth in this polar orbit. Now, we've just heard about this mission, it's just been announced, but already they're saying that they could launch as early as the end of this year. So that's within the next sort of 6 months. So we'll keep an eye on that and bring you news of it. But yeah, exciting times for human spaceflight, commercial spaceflight, private spaceflight. I just wish the prices would come down a bit so that I would get to fly. But if you are a rich crypto entrepreneur or anybody else that just has a few $1 billion stuffed down the back of the sofa and fancy sending me to fly to space, hit me up. I'm ready to go. Now, in less happy news, unfortunately, for private space, the rocket Factory Augsburg suffered a major catastrophe on Monday when they were testing their engines up at Saxavord Spaceport in Scotland. Unfortunately, there was a major anomaly with one of the engines, and that caused a huge and very catastrophic fire, which has basically completely destroyed the first stage of their RFA-1 rocket, which they were hoping to launch in the next few weeks or months from Saxavord. So that would have been the first vertical launch to take place from the UK. Yeah, that is now going to set them back. They have been really very open and transparent, talking about the issues that occurred. They think that it was an issue with one of the oxygen. There was an oxygen fire in one of the turbo pumps. Unfortunately, that sparked a kerosene fire, and yeah, the rest was really very, very dramatic. And I can only imagine, literally seeing your dreams go up in smoke, all the things that you've worked for must be incredibly hard. So I welcome the fact they have been able to do some analysis already to see what has happened. I'm glad that they are still ready and prepared to keep going. And the good news that we heard recently is that they have actually got a second first stage ready, that's already being built. It's actually a more advanced version of the one that was being tested and that was due to fly on the first flight. So that is good news, because originally when I heard this, I wasn't sure if they had a replacement for that first stage. All the other stages of the rocket are in the saxophore and ready to go, so they just need to work on getting that first stage tested and ready. They're talking about putting some improvements on the launch pad, which thankfully wasn't too badly disrupted by this fire. The way that the rocket fell when it collapsed didn't hit any of the major infrastructure, but one thing they're looking at is putting in a bigger fire suppression system, because what they had there already just couldn't cope with the size and ferocity of the fire that was caused. Hot tip, if you want to keep up on UK space news, you want to be following Tom June Official, or is it Official Tom June? Either way, check out Tom June UK Space News on YouTube, and he does really great, far more in-depth, detailed videos about what's happening, especially with those spaceports up in Scotland. So yeah, he's a great guy, give him a follow, and yeah, we will watch with interest. It does feel a little bit like deja vu, because when I did my news update just last time, I was reporting on the destruction of the first stage of a rocket during a hot fire test, and it was also a rocket that was due at some point to be launching from one of the UK spaceports. So I'm really hoping that next time I do a news update, we won't have a similar story. Some other quick headlines for you. NASA has signed a framework agreement with Saudi Arabia for a cooperation in aeronautics and the exploration and use of space, airspace and outer space for peaceful purposes. This comes after 2 Saudi Arabian astronauts were part of the Axiom 2 private commercial mission, astronaut mission, back in May 2023. We know the UAE is heavily involved in space. Qatar has been reasonably quiet, so I wonder if it will come on board at any point and get excited about space and join its neighbours. They do tend to compete a lot in the Middle East there, so I'm surprised that they have not also got the space bug in Qatar, but maybe they will soon. The Chandra X-ray Observatory has had a little reprieve. We heard in March that the NASA budget for 2025 was going to cause enormous cuts and perhaps even stop the mission being able to continue. We've just heard the news today that there has been some additional funding found to ensure that staff can keep their jobs in 2025 and keep things going. So that's really great news. Blue Origin have announced their next crewed flight, so NS-26, that's New Shepard. It will be happening on August the 29th, and the launch window opens at 2 o'clock British Summer Time. That's 1 o'clock Universal Central Time. And while we're on Blue Origin, we're all hoping and listening out for news of New Glenn, which is their heavy lift rocket that hasn't yet flown. We're sort of creeping closer and closer to when they're hoping to fly it. In fact, NASA is putting a Mars mission on New Glenn, which does then mean that the deadline for launch is kind of a bit more set in stone, because there are only certain times where Earth and Mars are sufficiently positioned that you could do a mission to Mars. So every couple of years you get these launch windows to Mars. And so they really do need to get this thing off the ground in October. Unfortunately, it's looking a little bit less likely to happen now. We heard there's an issue during a stress test and one of the upper sections failed. And also another section imploded due to the incorrect use of some pressure release valve. So that's a bit concerning, but with Blue Origin, you never know. They tend to keep things quite quiet, keep it under their hat, and then suddenly something happens. So keeping our fingers crossed for them. SpaceX recently had their Transporter 11 flight, and they launched 116 different payloads. One of those was the UK's first satellite that was being 100% funded by the Ministry of Defence. It's a research and development satellite built by Surrey Satellite Technology, and it's part of a £22 million contract that they were awarded for this. It's part of the UK Space Command. It's their first satellite, and the idea is it will provide intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, and will be the first of a constellation of satellites for the Minerva programme, and they'll be providing imagery for the UK Armed Forces. Now, I'm not usually a big fan, or I'm not ever a big fan of mixing military and space. I'm very much peaceful uses of outer space, thank you very much. Let's leave war on the planet, or, you know, just stop it altogether would be great. But while we're on the subject, I think it's just worth mentioning, I saw a note that the head of US Space Command, General Stephen Whiting, has called for space fires, suggesting the US must develop weapons in space to remain superior in that arena. So he would want those to act as a deterrent or potentially be actively used in war. These were comments that he made at the Army and Space Missile Defense Symposium in Huntsville, Alabama, at the start of August, and were reported in Air and Space Forces Monthly. Now, I wasn't sure entirely what he meant by fires. He didn't explicitly say so much in his comments. He didn't go into too much detail, but in terms of the context, apparently fires in this context means available weapons and systems to create specific lethal or non-lethal effects on a target. So yeah, we're talking proper weapons in space stuff here. Just a reminder, the Outer Space Treaty forbids any nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction in space, although it doesn't really go so far in the details as to explain or define what they mean by weapons of mass destruction. So I think there's a lot of people, especially military people around the world, who are looking at this and wondering what the other countries are doing, what they need to do to keep up, if not leapfrog the other countries. And it's interesting that these conversations, these are conversations that are now being said out loud rather than just sort of whispered about. Just one to keep an eye on. In slightly brighter news though, the European Space Agency has successfully conducted a lunar-Earth flyby of its JUICE spacecraft. So that's the Jupiter Icy Moons Explorer. It's on a really long and, it's quite a squiggly route to Jupiter. It was launched in April 2023, flew by Earth just in the last few days, 19th, 20th of August, and it will be flying by Venus next year. Then it will return back to Earth by September 26, January 2029, and eventually it will reach Jupiter in July 2031. So it's going to do some really exciting science, but you're going to have to wait a long, long time for it to get to its target destination. Now, the reason it's really exciting that this flyby has gone well is that it's a maneuver that's used to help it stay on this, highly mathematically calculated pathway to get it to Jupiter. You can't fly directly to Jupiter because it would take far too much fuel, and by the time you got there you would need to find some way of stopping, because otherwise you'd fly right on by, and you don't want to do that. But this maneuver has gone really smoothly. They didn't use up as much fuel as they was expecting to do, so that's great. That means they've got a bit of extra fuel that they can use when they finally get to Jupiter. They can hopefully extend the mission once they're there and do some more exciting stuff and send us back some even more juicy data. Juicy? You see what I'll get my coat. While we're thinking about space and exploration, one of the things I love is when astronauts share their photography from the International Space Station. They have this incredible view of the world that very few of us get to see or experience, but you can live vicariously through some of these beautiful photographs. And I've been watching on Twitter, astronaut Dominic has been sending down some really, really stunning pictures. He's taken pictures of Starliner, of storms, nighttime storms over India, aurora, really beautiful stuff. And what I'm excited about is that veteran astronaut Don Pettit, who took so many pictures when he was on the International Space Station that if you plotted the exact location of those pictures, you could track the path, the ground path of the space station through the number of photos he had taken. But he is a really innovative, interesting guy who will take some fantastic pictures in his next mission. He's launching on a Russian Soyuz on September the 11th. I have it on good authority that he has been thinking hard about what interesting things that he could do while he's up there and what new amazing pictures he could produce. So if you haven't already checked out, that's Dominic and astronaut Don Pettit. Both of them have incredible photography online from space, and do watch this space. I'm sure there'll be some more really great shots coming from space when Don Pettit is back up there. I did mention earlier that a cargo ship had reached the space station, and another thing I like to see is when the astronauts get really excited that there is some fresh fruit for them to eat. You know, can you imagine months of being cooped up, eating freeze-dried, dehydrated food that's warmed up by slightly tepid water and eaten from a packet, and then a cargo ship comes up and they pop in a few oranges for you? How exciting is that? Well, it's this exciting. Dominic here showing how joyful he is at having a piece of fresh, juicy orange. Nice. And finally, not really news, but I have completed a solar orbit. My orbit of the sun is complete. I had my birthday last week, and it was an absolute joy to receive messages from my space friends, my space family all around the world, and some lovely gifts and video messages. So thank you so much. It's an absolute privilege to know you, to be part of this community, and honestly, I can't thank you enough. It's been wonderful. A couple of ones I want to mention. This I should have perhaps mentioned when I was talking about Polaris Dawn, but it was one of the things that came in one of my space birthday packages. So this is a space pin from the company Launch Pins, who have a whole range of really, really cool space themed pins. This one is commemorating the first commercial spacewalk to take place in 2024. And we've got our Dragon capsule, the tether, and an astronaut in their SpaceX suit. So that is quite cool. Very happy with that. So launchpins.com, if you want to get your own, you can find that and so many more. Warning to space nerds, it's dangerous because the stuff's really cool. And secondly, I can't go without giving a big shout out to the lovely astronaut Katie Coleman. This is her new book, Sharing Space, and it was on my wish list of things that I wanted, I needed on my space bookshelf, and then it arrived in the post for me from Katie herself with a lovely little message written in the front thanking me for my work sharing space with you. So if you're watching, Katie, thank you so much. I will treasure this, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. Right, I best go, and let's find out what's going on with Starliner. Whichever version of this video you're watching, the bit at the beginning about the decision on whether they come home on Starliner or on Dragon will be correct. I'm going to switch them out and only publish the right one, and then we'll have more details about how they came to that decision later on. Until next time, bye bye.